So once we have the valuation agreed, so ultimately that's a decision for the sellers at this point. The independent valuer will present it to the sellers, and it's for them to determine whether that's something that they are willing to proceed with or not. So again, making the assumption that they are happy, then we can start to think about sort of structuring the transaction a little bit. So typically what we tend to see is that any excess cash that exists within the business, that will be used to help satisfy part of the initial purchase price. But one difference perhaps between employee ownership transactions and some other forms of transaction is that we do generally sort of see that the element of deferred consideration, so the money that the sellers don't receive straight away and that they have to wait a period of time to receive, is typically a larger proportion of the overall purchase price. And there are some specific reasons for that, which I'll come on to slightly in due course. But right at the outset, again, as we explore whether EOTs are an appropriate way forward, that's something that we're always looking to discuss with sellers and make sure that they're aware of that dynamic and it's something that they're comfortable with. One thing that we can sometimes do, though, if there's property assets owned within the business, again, to perhaps try and reduce the burden on the EOT as we move forwards and the amount of money that has to come up with to ultimately purchase the business, is that it can be possible to extract some of those property assets and put those into the hands of the selling shareholders rather than retaining them with the business. That's something that we've seen on occasion, and it can be a beneficial move. And at this point, as we're starting to think about the financial deal structuring, we also need to consider how the business is going to be managed on an ongoing basis. That's both within the trading operations, so the board of directors of the company itself, and also the trustees that will form that overarching sort of governance of the business and be responsible for making sure that things continue to be run in the best interests of the employees going forwards. So a really important aspect, and I suppose I've put it here under deal structuring, but arguably that's probably something we actually start talking about right at the outset, as soon as we're contemplating EOTs and whether it's a suitable way forward. We've got to make sure we've got the right people around that we can put into these very important roles as part of the transaction. So just very simply, here's a little sort of diagrammatic overview of what an employee ownership trust structure may look like. We may have some external funders coming in. I'll come on and talk about that a little bit more shortly, to provide some initial finance to the trading company, together with any surplus cash that it has. That will facilitate an initial contribution through to the employee ownership trust, which it will then use to make the purchase from the exiting shareholders. As we mentioned, that probably won't be the end of the transaction, though. There'll be some ongoing contributions out of future profitability required to continue to satisfy deferred consideration up to the point where the exiting shareholders have been fully paid for the agreed valuation price. Now, one I suppose beneficial thing around an employee ownership trust, unlike potentially some other forms of transaction, is that we get the benefit of having the opportunity to go through an advanced tax clearance process with HMRC. So within that, we're describing to HMRC exactly what we're looking to achieve with the transaction, who's selling, who's going to be involved in an ongoing basis, the purchase price, the structure of the purchase price, so how much cash and how much deferred, etc. Presenting all those terms to HMRC and asking for them to give a clearance on the transaction. They, once submitted, they have a statutory 30 days to respond to that. In our experience, they've typically taken most of that 30 days, if not every single day of it, but ultimately have then come back and been prepared to give acceptance. Hopefully that's partly down to some of the good work that the team have put into preparing that clearance and structuring the transaction in the first place. But I think it also does demonstrate the willingness and the keenness for HMRC to see these transactions take place. But one thing I should sort of mention as a bit of a caveat, whilst that clearance comes through, it's not a guarantee to those exiting shareholders that HMRC will never come back and have a look at the transaction in some way, shape or form. Importantly, they're not signing off on the valuation itself and guaranteeing that they accept that that is appropriate. But hopefully with a clearance in place, they would find it a little bit more challenging to come and do that in the future.